Welcome to another episode of the podcast. My name is Ben Donnelly. I'm a cinema major at Nova. I'm here with my team members, Saqqara, Carroll, and Roberto Ferriera, my fellow classmates. And our special guest today is Benjamin Bumgarner, an editor who's based in Los Angeles, has worked on television shows such as God Friended Me, Imaginary Mary, and currently working on the pilot for the new Quantum Leap series. We're excited to have you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Great insight.
Some main points I wanted to hit in terms of based on kind of your experience and what you've seen within the last few years, especially, how has the processing of editing evolved over the last few years?
You know, the process of editing from when I started was, I kind of started in that time period when computers were kind of starting to come around, and you were seeing this transition from physical film cut and splicing editing into computer-based. And that's how I kind of got into editing, was because our high school had a journalism program, and traditionally they were just cutting what was called tape to tape, which is like two basically VHS decks that would feed into a third. You'd have like an AB and then like a C deck, and basically you would basically transfer to that, which is what I think news did for years and years. And I'm assuming they don't do that anymore. I'm sure tape's not even really around that much. And we, at that point, had something called, I think, a video toaster, which was like a thumbnail-based editing system. There was no timeline. It was just a series of clips, which is kind of like more reminiscent of like what iMovie, used to be, or maybe still is. And then we donated what I call a nonlinear editing system, and no one knew how to use it. And that's how I kind of got involved into editing, was because, I had a computer growing up, which was at that time was not super common, for households to have them. And so I was like, oh, I'll play around with it. I'll figure it out. And so that's how I kind of fell into my love of editing, was through that. And during that time period, to actually be able to edit something, you had to get, basically your hands or purchase a system like an Avid. There was maybe like 2 or 3 out there at the time, and a lot of them cost like $80,000 to $60,000 just to be able to do like computer-based, like nonlinear editing. And so like it wasn't very common. It's not as ubiquitous as it is now. So it was a very specialized thing. And that's what I've kind of seen over time as like computers have gotten better, as things like YouTube and stuff have kind of come around, that like editing has just become a very common thing. It's like now you can do it on your phone, whereas it used to be you had to have access to, like, there was this basically this cost gap that, like, if you didn't have certain amount of money, then you wouldn't be able to necessarily edit anything unless you wanted to do it like in a linear fashion, like just breaking out your VHS decks and like, at your house with 2 VCRs and, cutting stuff that way, or doing it. I remember as a kid, like I would do stop motion. My parents had like a little Hi8 camera, and I would do stop motion, and just all the editing was just done in camera, because you could just start and stop. I had no access to anything. So that's kind of what I've noticed as far as like, how editing has changed. The software, it's like what I use now really hasn't changed too much. I mean, editing is such a simple process. You're taking 2 images and you're joining them together, or taking, stuff out of, so it's either an additive or subtractive process. And like, we were able to do it, 25 years ago with computers that were very basic, and it's very simple, so it doesn't take much to do that process. So yeah, that's kind of like as far as what I've kind of seen as far as the difference. But like I was saying earlier, like, it hasn't changed. What I use hasn't changed too much. What I've seen, I've seen with Final Cut 10, some new ways to approach it, but I have not ever got to use it yet. as far as with like the magnetic timeline and stuff like that. So there's still some innovations and things that are kind of happening, but for the most part, it's the same, but just everybody has access to it now.
I like how you talked about the accessibility, just
Mhm.
because a lot of times it's not even just editing, but like filmmaking in general. You know, in the 1900s and just in general, it's like you had to have money. You had to have access to a lot of this equipment and stuff. And so I think just in general, people are able to edit and make films off of your phone. And like, they're actually pretty good. I mean, just the standard of being able to do it, and you can do so much with it. And so I think a lot of creators are actually able to get their stories out there because they don't have to, you don't have to be like this big time with the whole production behind and everything to do it. I also noticed your hat, which is really funny because 1924, it's the first video editing machine. I think it's funny also, I know you said like your own editing is pretty archaic versus you getting like the latest and greatest technology. Why exactly do you not want to get the latest and greatest? Like, you know.
So it has a lot to do with the industry I work in. So I work in scripted television, which is, you know, the difference, like with TV, there's two different kinds, or typically three different genres. You have reality, which is a lot of your like, you know, Shark Tank and Ninja Warrior and those kind of things, you know, cooking shows and stuff. And you have scripted, which is what I do. And then you have like documentary. And a lot of times with at least in our industry in scripted television, we're like, I would say software wise, probably like can be like 3 or 4 years behind. Computers the same way. Like right now I have a trash can Mac is what we call them. Like my one in my house is like what we used to call like a cheese grater, which is like the 2009 tower. And the main reason that like we are many versions behind is because of like it's you know, with our industry, it's like we have to come in, like we start a show and we just have to work, and it all has to work. So there can't be any like surprises, there can't be any bugs. So that's why we kind of we find a version, we find something that works, and we kind of stay on that as long as physically possible. So that's the main reason that you know, we are not on the most hot rod machines and like running the latest version of Final Cut or whatever, you know, just because of like we're looking for very stable platforms that just allow us to come in and tell stories. Now, production's a different story. Like, you know, they have, you know, the red cameras, the Alexas, you know, and those things, and they have like, gosh, those cameras are probably, you know, probably $80,000. And then like the lens, like one lens you put on those things are probably like 40, 50 grand, you know, and they have a whole set of those and all the film lights. Like that's different, you know. But as far as post, yeah, it's like I said, I have a computer from 2009, and I was using that up until last year to do things on, you know, like we were still using those like a couple shows ago, you know, because of the way our workflow is, you know, that we're working with this offline material, like it just doesn't require a lot of, you know, processing power. So
all right, so
Awesome.
they come to you with the footage, and they pick the software that you have to work with, and
yeah,
because in my head
so
it was the opposite. They give you the footage and you're like, okay, I can use whatever I want.
yeah, so you know, if I'm doing independent projects, like I've worked for companies that do stuff for like the NFL and like various commercials and stuff like that, and sometimes I'll do that between shows, and a lot of times I did those on Premiere. You know, and so, you know, and that was based on what that company, this commercial company utilized and what they had all their editors work off of. With scripted television and a lot of television, even reality, a lot of it is cut on Avid. And that's a lot of that has to do with, you know, Avid's just, it's been around for a long time. When I first started learning nonlinear editing in my undergrad program, that's what we learned on. Premiere was just kind of starting at that point. We had classes where like our first class was Premiere, and it was like version 1 of it, I think. And then it switched over to the Avid. And but like the industry has been on that forever and ever, just because, you know, you have so many talented and Oscar winning and Emmy winning editors, and that's what they know. So like I've, you know, I don't foresee it changing, anytime soon. There's always been certain times when you see like things start to maybe take some momentum and go one direction. Like you have somebody who's really a talented premiere editor that like came from reality, and then they come over to a show and they're like, this is what I want to use. And I've even seen that doing these side projects with Premiere, where like sharing is like, it's not easy. It's like, hey, here's my whole project, bring this whole project in, and you're bringing in all this material that you don't need when only you need one little thing. But I know that they've been kind of developing and working on that. And then there's other things that like I utilize that the Avid does, which is like script-based editing, which is where you have an actual script, and we use these little markers to basically, be able to go, like if we want to look at every take where this actor says, get to the hospital, like we can click on that line and see every take of that. Which
That's awesome.
I love it. it's one of those things, some editors use it, some don't, but like once you kind of get hooked on it, it's hard to not have it. The newer part of it, I feel like, is what they have is called phrase find, which is something I think a lot of documentary editors use, which is where the software goes through and it analyzes all the words, and you can type in a word or phrase, like, if you're looking for, in a documentary, like this becomes way more situational, like you need somebody to say yes. So you type in yes, and you get every instance of yes within that interview footage. We don't typically utilize that, or like what it also, the phrase find is used for in documentary is you do a transcript. So you have a transcript of the interview that somebody types up, and then it will basically put marks on to match every word with your transcript. So now you have that paper edit, or that paper transcript that you can basically reference, and search within for words and phrases, and go right to that point in the footage. So
awesome. Yeah, that sounds like it makes everything a lot more convenient just in terms of finding material and stuff.
Yeah, I think in especially probably reality and documentary, that's a very like utilized and highly sought after tool. Like, I know in reality you have a lot of what they call predators, which are these producer editors that go through and do like pre-cuts and string outs and go through all the transcripts and like do all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that stuff's used a lot,
So one thing I started to think about, not necessarily something relating to technology, but something I was just curious about from your point of view. How much does the story change from what they give you versus what comes out through the editing? Is it a lot? Is it not a lot? Does it depend?
For television, at least the shows that I work on, a lot of them, network, there's such a small time window to turn these things around from when they're shot to when they air, that like it's difficult to kind of completely restructure them like you would a film, or maybe something that you're doing for like Netflix, or something like that, where you just have the time to go in there and just flip scenes like upside down. For the most part, what comes across the page, we're staying fairly close to. Obviously, sometimes we're lifting full scenes, we're lifting half a scene, like we'll, because of time, like when we do our first assembly, or what you would call like an editor's cut, the shows probably can be like 6 to 8 minutes over, maybe sometimes it's 12 minutes over what you need it to be. So a lot of times you're gonna, come into scenes like mid conversation. So instead of having the actor kind of walk into the room, sit down, grab a drink the drink, and then start his conversation, you're going to start like 4 lines into their conversation, coming out of the next scene. So like that's, I think, more common, as far as like just finding ways to kind of tell the story most efficiently. Obviously with a pilot, like this current pilot, we're doing a lot of restructuring and retooling and, helping performances and things either through like ADR and stuff like that. Because, with a pilot, you're you're trying to find the tone, you're trying to find the pace, you're trying to introduce all these new characters. And once the pilot's kind of in that set, then like the rest of the episodes, you know, you're not necessarily reinventing the wheel that much. You know, you're trying to get through these stories the most efficient, you know, way possible. You know, so there's not a lot of episodes where I feel like we've gone in and just had to completely restructure them. Obviously, you'll have issues where like maybe you have to reshoot a scene. You know, maybe the director runs out of time, you know, but that's typically what I run into. Like I'm sure like in features, you know, I can't, you know, I hear stories and read articles all the time or talk to friends, you know, in the industry that, you know, it's like they completely kind of retool sometimes, you know, and sometimes it's not the director that's doing it, it's the studio. Like there's things like, I know for instance, like with Suicide Squad, you know,
Yeah.
like, studio gets it and they're like, this isn't what we envision, it's not punchy enough. So they hire a bunch of, you know, music video editors, supposedly, I don't know, to come in. Allegedly, exactly. Who knows? You know, they could all have, you know, they could have been someone like me, I don't know. You know, I mean, I've cut music videos, so you could call me a music video editor, you know, it's like, call me a wedding video editor if you wanted to, I've cut those too. So, you know, that's come in and like basically retooled the film, you know. So, but like I'll say, you know, as far as like with TV, you know, we're attacking certain things, you know, when you do your kind of your first watch, a lot of times you'll know, like you'll have conversations either with like the showrunner or like the person on set or the director, and like sometimes things will get flagged early and you'll know it's coming down the pipe, and like, you know, either it gets addressed through like a reshoot or a pickup or something, or one instance I can think of, you know, like where we kind of come in and we kind of enhance things is like, you know, through, you know, one example from a show I just recently did, there was this whole gala that there's all these people. It was supposed to be a very fancy, affluent event, and they just didn't have time to shoot, you know, as far as like inserts of like hors d'oeuvres and wine bottles being poured and stuff like that. And like we get on to, you know, stock websites and just pull a bunch of footage down and we recreate a montage to basically supplement that, you know, because that was something that came down from the network, that they were not feeling that this event was, you know, as fancy as it should feel, you know. So those are the kind of, I think, the scenarios that I run into a lot of time. So, but like nothing, I've not ran into too much where it's like, you know, we're taking the end of the show or move it to the beginning of the show and playing with time as far as like, you know, flashing forward and then flashing back. You know, those shows do exist, and I'm sure they do a lot of that. In my current pilot, we played around with flashbacks a lot, and had more complicated and simple versions of those. So, you know, I think it just really depends on what type of a show you're working on, what type of story that you're telling, that, you know, how you may restructure based on, you know, the script. So
how much time do you usually get to edit an episode? You probably have more time with pilots, but when you're like on the grid,
pilots are a little bit longer, but not necessarily. They still are pretty compressed because it's like this one where they're trying to get it basically finished for upfront. So network pilots are still pretty fast and intense. You know, and a lot of, you know, pilots for like the streaming services have kind of gone away. When I did a pilot for Amazon called Good Girls Revolt, which was based on these women that worked at Newsweek in the 60s, based on a true story. And that was during a process when pilots, like, you could vote on them. Amazon had a voting process and you could vote, and then whatever ones were voted the highest basically got picked up. I know a lot of them don't do pilots, they just pick up shows wholesale. my current pilot, what you get a lot with pilots and why they're a little bit longer is they actually shoot longer. So instead of shooting over like 8 days, which is like what most TV shows do, they shoot over like 14 to 18. So they're a longer shooting schedule. So, and certain TV shows, most TV shows I'm used to shoot around 7 or 8 days. I'm sure some of the fancier ones like Westworld and, like a Stranger Things, they probably shoot 25, 30. They're probably like a feature. They probably shoot a long time, I would assume.
Yeah.
I can only imagine to be able to kind of get that kind of quality. So we typically, so like the time that we get to cut an episode, so obviously we get all the days that they're shooting. So like if it's an 8-day shoot, we get those 8 days and we're cutting basically after the first day of shooting, that footage goes to the lab that night. And then in the morning, the assistant will prep all that and we'll start cutting dailies. So we're always like a day behind. So we'll usually get all the days, 8 days of dailies. A lot of times we'll get 2 or 3 days to do like an editor's cut, which is to basically assemble it, put sound effects, music. I mean, a lot of times we're putting sound effects as we go. Music we usually don't touch until, all the scenes are kind of combined together. And then there's a 4-day director's cut, which is like, that's the standard with DGA. That's kind of the rules. In features, I know they have a standard minimum that they get as well. And then usually it's a 5 to 6 day producer's cut. And then depending on how you're kind of set up with the studio network, there's a day, for studio and a day for network. And sometimes as the show progresses, those will just get combined. Especially if like your studio and your network, like on this pilot, our studio is Universal and the network's NBC, and they're basically the same thing. Even though they are kind of separate, they're different people, and they have different, goals, but, so sometimes they'll just combine the cut because it's all internal. I've done a lot of shows that are like Warner Brothers for CBS or Warner Brothers for CW or, which is CW still around? Yeah, I think it is.
They do that like Sony.
Yeah,
it's Sony with the NBC.
It's ABC Family that changed. It's now Freeform.
Freeform, yeah.
I've done a couple ABC Family shows, and which at that point, even ones that transitioned into Freeform. So then we, there's 1 or 2 days for the studio network, and then usually based off the network notes, we'll send that cut back. They'll sign off and be like, it's great, lock it. We'll lock it. And then we'll do like a spot, like a sound, a music spot. And then for like, usually like a day, and then we're on to the next episode. And sometimes that second episode's already starting while we're maybe in studio cut. So like maybe I'm getting studio notes while I'm still getting dailies for the next episode. So just depending on the schedule, how much overlap there is. So there's not a lot of.
That's insane. We hear this crazy stories about like those 24 episodes shows that the actors are getting the script like the day before and they're shooting and they're like always behind. I wonder how the editors are in this loop. How many days, how many hours maybe they have to get the dailies out.
Yeah, I mean a lot of times we're not necessarily have to get anything like, I know shows like that where they basically sometimes even start shooting without a script. I know some of them because I've just worked with directors that have worked on those shows, and but like a lot of times that doesn't necessarily affect post because it's like it's still a day's worth of shooting. Maybe it's a little bit more chaotic because they didn't get anything that the showrunner wanted. But I've not really felt, flaws in production that affects the post schedule. Sometimes they've been worried about a scene not working, and you'll get a phone call where it's like, hey, can you cut this scene first and send us something tonight? So that way we can look at it to make sure that we got everything and there isn't any issues and we don't need to pick anything up because we're gonna basically break this set or this actor's flying home, on Friday. So if we can look at something on Wednesday, we know we can bring them back in. So I've definitely been in scenarios like that, where they want to see a scene early, just to basically see if they got what they needed as far as coverage and performance, and everything is kind of good. But it's not very common. So a lot of times you'll just have conversations, and like, you know, either the director or the showrunner call and be like, do you have everything you need? And you're usually like, yeah, I'm good. So that's what it is most of the time. It's just like they just have a conversation with the editor and ask them like, hey, are you going to be able to put this together? And you're most of the time you're like, yeah, we're good. I think a lot of that comes from, you know, I don't run into problems a lot of times because, you know, on set, they're usually running 2 cameras, and sometimes they're running 3 cameras in television. So, you know, you're usually able, because of that secondary camera, you know, able to get around a lot of issues and problems, you know. Where it gets problematic is when you are in situations where they shoot a one, or, you know, or they shoot this big kind of amazing crane shot that comes down, and like you have nothing to cut to. And, you know, the writer comes in, it's like, I want to start on this line. And you're like, okay, or I want to punch into this actor, you know, for a close up in this, you know. So those are kind of the scenarios that we kind of run into.
How do you work with kind of like maybe, well, number one, when you want to add your own creative flair, because, you know, editing is an art. And so like, how do you work with that within the constraints of having to work obviously with the director and everybody, because they have a very specific vision? Because I know some directors and editors, like they have to fight it out because, like, you know, directors will be very attached to a shot and the editor is like, nah, dude, like, you know, it's just not gonna work. Or I know that because you were talking about like having to reshoot, or when there's issues within a shot where it's like, I don't have like that in between footage to connect the shots. And so then it can be really difficult because you're like, how am I going to cut this with it making sense, but that not looking too choppy or weird or anything? How do you deal with that? Or do you have to deal with that a lot?
So there's 2 questions there. So the first one, I'll start the first one and then I'll answer your second one. So the first one, as far as like adding your kind of own, you know, signature or like creative flair to like your own episodes. And what I'll say about that is, you know, the goal of, you know, doing a TV show, I feel like that's more accomplished if you're like the pilot editor. You can really kind of dictate the tone, the pace, like what kind of stylistic things that you choose to do, you know, through montage or, you know, various like, you know, flutter cuts, or, you know, certain things, you know, like let's say like you want, you know, certain like a flashback, you just pull out all the sound for the most part, you know, or things like that you can really then dictate as what kind of the show is and what the show's language is. A lot of times when I've come on to shows, you know, if you're doing things that have not been done, there's always the question's always brought up, like, is this our show? Is this our language? And it's interesting because it's like you may have a unique idea of how to approach something, and, you know, you'll get the response of like, this doesn't feel like our show. So the goal, you know, when I approach material is always to kind of like make sure it feels like the show. And like the goal is not for me to like, you know, put whatever, you know, unique stylistic choices that I have in there. It's basically to tell the story as best as possible. You know, and I have certain tools and things that I like to use. But, you know, for the most part, a lot of that I feel like is dictated in the script. And, you know, you can try things, but it doesn't necessarily always mean that it's going to come through. You know, I feel like a lot of times, you know, things that I feel like are more, that feel like when you watch an episode and you would be like, oh, I know, you know, Benjamin worked on this episode, would probably be more, you would hear it more in maybe the musical choices, the source songs and things like that. I feel like that's one thing that we can have a strong influence in, is like, as far as like what type of music goes into an episode. You know, visually, it's just hard because it's like there's, you know, the show has usually a certain pace, you know, either like you're a show that likes to live in the close-ups, that likes to live here, you know, or you're a show that likes to live wide and let everything play out in the wides. So a lot of times you're kind of adapting to that show and what the showrunner's vision is for that show, and trying to work with those constraints. And then every once in a while you'll get something that's unique to the episode, like a specific montage, or something that's a little bit more stylistic where you can kind of put your little touches on there. But to me, it's I have so many friends that work in the industry, and it's like when I watch a show that's theirs, it's incredibly hard to tell who cut the episode, because it just kind of feels like you have the same actors that know their characters, and like it feels within that world. So that's what I can say about that, like as far as like what we kind of do. What I feel like I bring a lot of times to the table is solutions to kind of like enhance the story, as far as like, hey, let's split screen this shot where we can have this actor, deliver this line sooner, or like ways to compress time and tools to kind of like tell the story better, little tricks and things like that. Going through the footage and finding shots that were basically recorded after they said cut. Sometimes it's those things that you bring to the table as an editor, is like finding solutions. Like there's problems, they can't go back and reshoot, and then how are we going to address these problems? And enhance the story that maybe for whatever reason, because of time, that the director just wasn't able to do. So that's the answer to your first question. And then your second question, it's so interesting because like depending on the show, continuity is something that like is sought after, and like, oh, we have to kind of remain a certain amount of continuity or the viewer is going to be pulled out. And then you have certain shows, like one, for example, that I've watched recently, Winning Time by Adam McKay, where continuity is not really a thing. If you've ever seen any of his other stuff, like The Big Short and stuff, like I know with this Winning Time, it's like you're watching it, someone's coming down the stairs, they start a conversation, and all of a sudden it jumps into a different room, and the conversation's changed, and then it just cuts to a random picture on the side of a wall, and then it cuts to something else. And that's something that, like, when you're watching the first episode, you're kind of like, oh, this is interesting. But as you're in the second and third episode, it doesn't even phase you anymore. It's just part of the language of that story. So depending on what kind of, content you're creating, I feel like you can deal with certain issues certain ways. It can be more stylistic. Like, let's say you have an issue bringing somebody into a room, maybe you just cut away to something else, to a photo or a hand of, someone, setting something down, and come back into the conversation. Maybe it's more, story-wise, where maybe you come into the scene halfway into it, to get around those problems. As far as like, and that's what I was kind of talking about, is, sometimes it's what I call split screening, which is where, you're basically doing a roto, a half the screen, to be able to deal with like, an actor's position or body position to make them match somebody else. So that's one tool that I use a lot, because we shoot a lot of what I call like dirty overs, over the shoulders, where like, somebody's in frame, and you'll have things like lip flap where they're talking, in the corner of the frame, and you maybe need to use a certain reaction or something. So you're doing basically a split to kind of create, the performance that you need, and let's say like you have just like a two-shot with two different actors, and they're supposed to look at each other at the same time, and they're not doing that on set. That's another instance where we, we'll split screen things to kind of control the performance. So those are things that, like, when we have issues with set, that we'll utilize those type of tools. Sometimes it's as simple as just punching in, and creating a second shot when you don't have a second shot. Like, I know depending on what network I'm working for, like, we deliver like this pilot, it's delivered in HD, is 1080p, but they shoot in like 4K. So there's all this extra resolution that we have available. So like if they shoot, you know, like a medium shot, like how I am currently positioned, you know, you can create a close up just by blowing up the shot and getting around certain things. So sometimes, you know, you're doing things like that, you know, using blow ups to kind of get around problems, you know, where like, let's say they didn't pick somebody up, you know, or maybe you're just blowing up the shot enough to where the frame's empty, you know, and the actor kind of comes into it where it starts clean, you know, or blowing it up enough to where it's clean and you zoom out digitally and, you know, then the actor is there. So, you know, those are a lot of the tools that we utilize on our side as far as to kind of deal with things, that problems that may come from set, you know, and sometimes maybe it's just like a scene just isn't working. And instead of, you know, taking it for what it is, maybe it's repurposed into something else. You know, my one CBS show that I worked on, God Friend of Me, we always at the end, the protagonist, he had a podcast. So at the end of the show, it would always go to him in front of his mic narrating his podcast, and it would be a series of shots reflecting on what had happened in the episode and the lives that he had changed and impacted. And a lot of times what the director would do, which was incredibly smart, is he would shoot it at 48 frames a second, which we would then speed back up and run dialogue over. So those scenes were always designed that like, hey, if we were hurting for time and we don't have time to run this dialogue at the end, that we could basically repurpose those scenes into more of a montage, and just have a series of shots as he's narrating his podcast. You know, whereas scripted, he would start the narration of the podcast, it would hand off, you know, then two other people would have a small conversation and they would hand off another small conversation. But if we got into a situation where like that wasn't working or we didn't have the time, we could repurpose those as just as a strictly like dialogue free montage. So, you know, those are also sometimes the tools, is taking a scene that, you know, is not working and repurposing it into something else. Maybe it's, you turn it into like a memory, maybe you turn it into a flashback, or, you know, it's like, or you turn it more into kind of a montage, you know, just to get you into the next scene. Maybe you pull out all the dialogue and you introduce some kind of a narration, and just use the visuals that are available, you know. So those are a couple examples of how we kind of deal with problems, you know, and this pilot has been a great experience as far as like, sometimes things work on the page and then you get there and you shoot them and for whatever reason, they're not working as well. Maybe the joke's not landing, you know, as funny as it was in the table read. Maybe there's something weird in the background that like totally pulls you out of the scene. You know, sometimes you can have background actors that are high-fiving in the background while somebody's dying in the foreground, and like, so you have to deal with that. So, you know, so those are a couple examples of how we kind of deal with, you know, things. You know, and sometimes maybe it's, you know, it's in embracing those jump cuts, you know. I know when I first started cutting, there was always this instinct to make everything, you know, smooth and the continuity always matches perfectly. But if you watch a lot of stuff and you watch it really closely, there is a lot of tricks. And like, I think a lot of great editors, you know, they throw continuity out the window, depending on, you know, what it is, and the content, you know, so, and, you know, they'll utilize little tricks, as far as like utilizing motion, you know, utilizing sound. Sound's a big thing that kind of can really help an edit, you know, as far as pre-lapping things, you know, like the other day, like I was watching a little bit of Moneyball, you know, and they'll take a pre-lap for that example is, you know, you'll hear a crowd cheering and that will pull you into that next scene, you know. So there's a lot of even things you can do through sound to help sell your edits, you know, like let's say, you know, an example you said, like, you know, it's like you have some kind of continuity issue that sometimes maybe it's throwing in kind of a loud door slam or something, you know, that kind of you're embracing the jar the visual jar that you're getting with something sound wise that tells the audience that no, this is how it was intended, you know, that like, no, this is okay, this is part of the story, you know.
Mm.
You know,
So
I can think of, go ahead. Yep.
Oh, I was just gonna say, not to cut you off, but in terms of continuity, something I started to think about was I remember I was editing a video for school, and there's something I shot, and in one shot, it was as simple as like a character's arm was over here, and then in the reverse shot, their arm is like way over here, and it drove me crazy that I couldn't make them match up. So I just kind of left that continuity error in there, and even though it was in my head, it turns out nobody else noticed it. I was wondering how much of that gets by on like a major kind of television show.
Yeah, and that's one thing you kind of have to judge and like have conversations, you know, with, you know, that's why like I love working collaboratively because, you know, either like I'll bring my assistant or somebody in and be like, hey, look at this. Does this bump you? Does anything in here bump you? You know, I'll use my wife a lot of times, you know, because I feel like she doesn't watch a lot of television. So like, she just doesn't cue into those certain things. So yeah, I feel like it's, you know, as an editor, you can drive yourself mad with those kind of things. You know, a lot of times what I try to do is just lay an edit down, you know, and with all the continuity errors and everything, and then take a step back from it and then just see how it plays. And then, you know, once you're kind of like, okay, this is playing the way I want, then kind of deal with those issues, you know. And sometimes it's as simple as this is another tool we use a lot, which is basically flopping a shot. So like, let's say that the camera crossed, you know, the line, and, you know, you're having, you know, like you said, your hand issue. If you just flip that shot, you can kind of, you know, sometimes fix those errors, you know. Obviously, if there's words in the background, that becomes an issue because those get flipped. But if there's not, a lot of times you can kind of get away and fix eye lines and things like that and kind of restructure, you know, those issues. You know, like sometimes if it's, you know, if there's like a hand issue like that, it's like I said, that maybe we just blow up past it, you know, and just hide the hand, you know, so that it's not as much of an issue depending, you know, or kind of recreate the shot. And then sometimes it gets as bad as where we send it off to VFX to paint out the hand, you know, because it's just something that like we can't get around for whatever reason, you know. So yeah, I mean that's the thing with continuity. It's all about, to me, just keeping the audience engaged, because you can drive yourself insane with continuity. And like I said, if you watch a lot of content with an eagle eye, there's continuity mistakes all over the place. Just inherent in everything that we watch. It's just when the sound's good and, you know, it's all colored, you know. That's another thing too. Sometimes that's difficult for me is when you deal with dailies, and if a shot's really dark and you cut to something that's really bright, that pulls me out. You know, so you're dealing with those little things, and sometimes you'll have an edit that's not working, it's bumping you, and then it goes to color and it comes back and like it just plays smooth, you know, because it's like you're not having that juxtaposition of like a lighter, you know, shot into a darker shot, you know, of the shot reverse shot and stuff. Like it's all uniform. So, you know, there's a lot of things that I know that bump me in the edit, that once we kind of mix and color, that like a lot of them will go away. And sometimes you have to just let that go and just kind of, it's like, okay, this is what's best for the story. So I'm going to let this edit go, and I'm going to have what I would, you know, assume as like a bad edit in my cut, but like 99.9% of people watching do not feel that way at all, you know. You know, like I said, that example of Winning Time, you could say that show is full of 1,000 of bad edits, you know, but I think that's what makes it so good and services the story, and it keeps you kind of, they gain a visual engagement by having a lot of things, you know, that are not necessarily, don't match continuity, you know. So, and they're able to kind of like take something that may be more not as exciting, like a certain conversation, kind of spice it up through, cutting away to a picture or to a cigarette in an ashtray, just in the middle of the conversation,
Yep.
So I think it's, a lot of times that stuff can be subjective, and just because all your continuity is good doesn't mean you're telling a good story. Sometimes you can tell better stories through terrible continuity, and terrible matches, and sometimes that's actually, something that you want to utilize for effect in the story. Like maybe you want to make something jarring, like maybe it's an action sequence, maybe it's a war sequence, and you want those mismatches because you want the audience to always be in a state of, discomfort. Like that's something you're trying to actually put them in, so they kind of have this, subjective experience through a certain sequence.
Yeah,
What about
absolutely.
what about like some of your inspirations or studying, I guess, practice? Because winning like best editor for the Academy Awards or anything, I just kind of want to know what you feel like an aspiring editor would really need to get into in order to, because you talked about like, oh, editing like this or cutting like that, et cetera, and I feel like that still takes like a lot of inspiration and experience and a creative mindset. So like, what would you feel like is some of your editing inspirations, and like what would you recommend to future people?
What I've heard that I always recommend is the best thing is not an editor who cuts film, but a filmmaker who edits. And I think, as an editor, I feel like finding inspiration, for me is just finding good stories that kind of speak to you and seeing what works about those stories. It's so unique as far as like, with editing, like they call it an invisible art for a reason, because you don't want the audience to be perceiving that there's even editing taking place or cuts into picture. So to me, it makes it so hard to kind of find like, oh, I love this editor, I love his style, because so much of that sometimes is inherent through the director. Obviously I love a lot of Michael Kahn, who cuts a lot of Spielberg stuff. There's a lot of editors that like I look up to, that I've worked with, and the reason that I kind of more would say they influence me, because I know what they're working with. Like I know what those dailies look like, I know the problems they're dealing with and how they're dealing with these situations. If you're working with someone like a Steven Spielberg, I'm sure the material you're getting is great. You have all this amazing camera work, all these amazing performances, and I feel like when I've worked with certain directors, and actors, it's like, it's almost the content puts itself together. Like it just all clicks and it's magical and it just works for the most part. So, as far as what I would recommend, as far as an editor, I think the things that have kind of influenced me, that's such a good question. It's like, there's just so much, that I feel like, I think it's, it's not just other editors. I feel like there's a lot of, things in the world, whether it be, something as a book, or a painting or things like that. But as far as like, for me, that's kind of influenced me would obviously probably the teachers that I had in film school, the content they showed, the examples that they gave. Obviously I have a certain, films that I love. I'm obviously I'm a huge Star Wars fan. So, I was heavily influenced by those films growing up. And I feel like that's played a pretty integral role into my journey and coming out here to LA was because of my kind of influence and just kind of being blown away by those stories. And what's so amazing about, those stories is those stories were also influenced by other filmmakers like Akira Kurosawa, in a lot of different genres, like, films like The Searchers or Westerns and things like that, that because of those films have kind of led me to other genres and things that I feel like that have influenced me. And I'm constantly, what I find is to try to become a better storyteller. I'm reading books about either, acting or directing or, all the other crafts as well. Because I feel like that's incredibly important, because I feel like as an editor, you're kind of, you're dealing with all of those things. Sometimes you're having to be the cinematographer a little bit, because you're a shot isn't working or you're having to recreate a new shot. So I think having an understanding of cinematography, of framing, is incredibly important. I feel like, you have to be a pretty decent sound designer too. So finding influence in, sound, whether that be through, other films or television, or, sometimes there's even podcasts that do things sonically that I'm like, wow, this is interesting. Like you'll hear that, radio, because that's all you have is the ear, that you'll hear things and little tricks that they do that kind of you can influence and utilize in your work. So yeah, that's a big thing for me. Like I'm always trying to, I'm always watching content and seeing kind of what's being done, how they approach the stories. So I would say it's just a combination of like all things, as far as just watching, current things that I love, and also kind of being influenced by just everything that's kind of just even out there in the world. I feel like, whether that be just a simple story that you read in the paper or anything like that, because at the end of the day, that's all we're, at least what I'm doing for my job is we're just telling stories, and we're using very simple tools to tell those stories. So
Nice. That's a good answer. Just, I like how you said, just kind of like inspiration can kind of come from any source. It doesn't exclusively have to be editing, or like if you're like a screenwriter or something, your inspiration doesn't have to come from screenwriting. It's just, you want to take in everything you can.
And another thing I'll say too is it's like, I'll even watch stuff that a lot of these YouTube creators do, and there's all sorts of impressive. That's the thing that's just kind of blown me away. It's just what these kind of, one-man armies, which some of them are way more than that. Some of them have whole teams. You don't see the whole teams, but like, just do with their content. Like there's one guy I'll watch periodically on YouTube, and he does a channel where he bought, I think it's a silver mine in California. And he does this whole series where he basically just goes through like exploring the silver mine that he bought, and, through the use of like drones and whatever, like he does this whole documentary series. And, I find sometimes inspiration in those type of things that you just even find there, like what they do, and how they utilize, certain things. So that's one thing, like we were talking about continuity, like you watch a lot of YouTube content, and they'll do something that I think is seen as a no-no in my kind of genre, which is like you're a face and just cutting out words and staying on the same face, where it's just like you're just cutting from face to face to face, and you're just having these jump cuts within the interview. But I feel like this current generation that's on YouTube, that's something that like no one even blinks at it anymore. It's not something it's just kind of inherent in the language of, that, medium now. So, and I feel like that's probably even like there's influence that can be gained with that, like maybe you're cutting a show and you're having all these problems, and like, you know what, I'm just gonna embrace this, and we're going to, you know, maybe the actor happens to be breaking the fourth wall and looking at camera, and we're just going to cut this thing up, you know, like you would see some other content, you know. So that's another example. Like it could be, it isn't necessarily always have to be, you know, film or television. You know, I feel like there's even, like I said, either, you know, there's sonic influences and there's sometimes visual influences.
So I think we've had a great conversation, definitely very good advice, good topics we've covered. I wanted to kind of close out, circling back to kind of the technology side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious, what, in terms of like, we were talking like future editors, you know, students who edit, what would you suggest in terms of more, you know, recent and evolving softwares and items that can help them with their editing?
Yeah, so, you know, I think it really depends on what your goal is, you know, as far as like, is your goal to be a YouTube content creator and just do your own content by yourself? And if that's the case, you know, obviously using Premiere or Final Cut is the way to go. You know, if your goal is to maybe work in scripted television, or, you know, reality or documentary, you know, maybe learning the Avid is definitely going to be something that's a necessity. So I think knowing what your goal is, and maybe your 5-year goal is different than your 10-year goal. Maybe you want to produce YouTube content for a couple of years, and then maybe, you know, for whatever reason, you're like, you get burnt out and you're like, I want something more. Maybe I want to do work on television or features. That can change. So, you know, obviously if you're interested in working in, you know, the film and television industry, I definitely highly recommend, you know, learning the Avid, you know, building a good technical skill set. You can come out, you know, work as an assistant, and then eventually, you know, I mean, that's how a lot of us have kind of transitioned. I obviously, when I came out here, I started as an assistant editor, and because I, you know, through my school, they taught the Avid. So I had this knowledge of the Avid that I was able to translate over, and just hit the ground running as far as that goes. So, you know, that's what I definitely recommend. You know, but like the software doesn't make the editor, you know, obviously the editor is what's most important, you know. You know, you could give Windows Movie Maker to, you know, some of these Oscar award winning editors, and they would put out a beautiful film, you know, if that even, I don't know if Windows Movie Maker even exists anymore. I don't know. I was thinking something like the cheapest, you know, simplest thing.
Yeah.
You know, and then what I would say, you know, I actually started before I knew 100% that I wanted to be an editor. Like when I was an undergrad, I was actually interested in also going into animation. So I took some animation classes. My undergrad degree was very unique in the sense that it was an electronic arts degree. So like there was a film aspect to it, there was a sound aspect to it, there was a multimedia aspect, and then there was an animation aspect to it. And so like because of that, I learned 2D animation, I learned 3D animation, and I found those tools are very helpful because it's like I said, when you through your editing process, you may need to do things. So having an understanding of like keyframing and things like that, I think is incredibly beneficial. You know, if you're creating your own content, having, you know, an understanding of like Photoshop and After Effects is incredibly beneficial. You know, and depending on what kind of content that I'm working on, or if I'm working with like a company that does more stuff, like I said, like for the NFL, I may have to get into more of those kind of things and get into dealing with, you know, maybe I have to utilize a certain piece of software or something like that for that. So those are kind of my recommendations.
Awesome. Yeah.
Wow. I feel like there's so much more questions I could ask. And just for time's sake, we can kind of close it out. Is there any final remarks or advice you would have? And also, is there anything, like you mentioned, you had a website, anything you'd like to promote? That like we were talking Quantum Leap pilot, I'll definitely be checking that out.
Yeah, I mean, that's the next big thing for me that hopefully will come out this fall is Quantum Leap. I'm really excited about it. I was a huge fan of the show growing up. Like
That's great.
We talked about influences, you know. That show for me, you know, I love content that you can kind of watch as a family. That was something that I experienced with my, you know, parents and grandparents watching together that we all kind of loved. Quantum Leap, what was so unique about it was it got to delve into so many different genres, you know, through its time travel, whether that be like film noir or, you know, either like a rom-com, like they just all different genres that they got to play with. So that's one thing I'm excited about if the show does get picked up, as you know, it's the same creators that I did God Friended Me with, which, you know, that show is basically, we were doing a version of Quantum Leap. Like it's a very similar concept where you have one person that's going around and trying to help people, you know. It's just, you know, that show, you know, it was all set in modern time. There was no time.
So that was just a rehearsal.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was the warm up for it.
That's what it feels like, kind of getting into the pilot. It's like, you know, it's very similar. I mean, that's probably why, you know, Universal sought out Brian Wimbrand and Stephen Lillian to do that show, is, you know, because they, you know, obviously we're already big fans and we're doing something similar that I feel like worked really well. So yeah, that's and my website. I don't do a YouTube channel, so my kids they always talk about wanting to do one, but we've not done one yet. So I have nothing to plug as far as that. And then my website's just up there, just for as far as like for you know, work and stuff. Just when I ever, you know, I send a resume, it's like if they're not familiar with any of the shows or stuff I've worked on, that's why I have it up there. Which is it's just my name. It's just BenjaminBumgarner.com. Yeah, that's a good question. You know, Watchmen I loved. I think I loved just kind of like some of the stories it was telling, like the whole thing about the Tulsa massacre, which I wasn't super familiar with, you know, and that story was fascinating, and just, you know, it's just really well told narrative storytelling, and some of the characters and stuff like that. And then, like, I was trying to think, like, I haven't seen Euphoria. Trying to think of something that kind of like editorial wise that kind of stood out. Like I said, Winning Time, it's like, it reminds me of some of these films growing up that, like when I was going into film school, that were heavily influential to me, like Memento or Requiem for a Dream, you know, that just, you know, were very, like, had a lot of stylistic element. Yeah, exactly. So I think like those, like you know, those are good. I enjoy watching those sometimes, because it's just like, it's like we talked about earlier with continuity. Like you get caught up in that stuff. When you watch a show like that, and you're like, what am I wasting my time for? like just put it down, cut down, like just cut to, you know, it's just like, just cut to something. Like you're in control. You tell the audience what you want them to see, you know, and they're either going to engage or they're not. So, you know, those are a lot of them. You know, obviously, like I said, I'm a Star Wars fan, so I enjoyed, you know, The Mandalorian. And obviously, what they did with that technology, utilizing the dome, was, you know, unbelievable. I hope. Well, I don't know if Quantum will utilize something like that, but it's something that, you know, I'd love to kind of see or be around. I actually, a good editor that I worked with, this Rachel Goodluck Katz, one that I look up to. She's phenomenal. She's cutting season 3 of The Mandalorian. I assisted her back in the days. I did a couple pilots with her and stuff. So, you know, those are the kind of like, Watchmen was a big one, and Winning Time more recently. I think it's just stylistically, you know, it is another one that I've watched recently. You know, so there's not much that I watch that I'm not kind of influenced, or, you know, sometimes something can be really bad and that influences you. There's a lot of time,
true. Yeah.
You know, there's some terrible movie when you start having that imposter syndrome, and you watch a film, you're like, oh my gosh, like could be, I've seen things that are not very.
You can watch something really bad and it just brings your
Mhm.
your life all the way up.
Yeah, you're like, well, this episode that I did cut actually is pretty good, comparative or whatever. So.
All righty. That was great.
Awesome.
That was great.
Great
Yeah, thank
conversation.
you.
Really appreciate it. Good luck with all the editing and everything. Stay in touch.
All right, we'll do.
Awesome.
Have a
Thank you
great
so much,
day.
Thank
man.
you. You have a great
See you
day.
guys. You
Take
too.
care. Bye.